Each time we've managed to catch up with Bill Bowtell, it's been an absolute delight. One, because he gives us so much clarity and gives us so much common sense, and there's a reason for that. He's been a strategic consultant on health policy for much of my lifetime. He's someone that was around in the days of the HIV, played a tremendous role in getting that not only the policies that were needed in order to get some control at a time when the world didn't know too much about HIV. Bill, welcome to the program.
Thanks, George.
You've got a new book. I'm very delighted that we've found the time, that you found the time to write it. Let's have a look at it. The name of the book is Bill Bowtell, Unmasked, The Politics of Pandemics. Now, what in heaven's name set you off and you felt the need to write a book?
Well, as you say, George, for my sins, I was around in the HIV days, almost 40 years ago now. And that was the first big viral eruption in our lifetimes.
First big scare.
And it was extremely scary. You recall, for months, nobody knew what was causing it. It sounds very odd to people now, but it took a year and more for people to even understand that a virus was causing the infection. So out of that experience and how we did deal with it okay in Australia, but didn't deal with it okay in much of the rest of the world, it's like a big wheel turning full circle. Almost 40 years later, another virus comes along, and there have been many in the interim, but it's caused more havoc and mayhem and economic disruption than HIV ever did, although the HIV death toll, regrettably, is in the high 30 millions now. Over 35 million people died over the last 4 decades, and many hundreds of millions more were affected. So we're not there, and hopefully we never will be with COVID, but it's the same problem. And my thesis in the book, I got so wrought up by it at the end of last year. Nature creates viruses, and it creates viruses all the time. Every year, every day, they assault humanity. So nature creates viruses, but politics creates pandemics. The pandemics we have to suffer for and through are the result of decisions made and not made by politicians. I know it sounds paradoxical, but viruses are just viruses. They're the expression of physics, chemistry, biology, mathematics. They're not the zombie apocalypse. They don't come from outer space to destroy the planet. They are, in my experience, reasonably easily containable if you do certain things behaviorally. And then if science comes along and finds a treatment or cure or so on, as science does after a while, then you can get through that initial emergency period quite well. The problem comes from panic, fear, the idea that you can negotiate with a virus as a politician, the worry about the economic impacts and so on. And as we've seen in the world in the last year, we've run the whole gamut from countries that have figured out what the virus is and how to clobber it and get rid of it and not let it become a huge problem, to other countries, the United States under the previous administration, the UK, Europe, where they took every wrong decision they could, and the death toll is what it is. And in India, of course, in recent days, we've seen that on steroids, regrettably.
Yeah, the numbers are off the chart. Can I just run something past you? All those areas that you speak of that have had problems containing COVID, the contagion, it seems to me it's those areas where we've got great populations, great movement, and great density. Am I off the mark or am I on the money?
Sorry, just say that again, George,
it seems to me, when it was Italy, when it was France, when it was America, when it was Britain, when it was India, China, and so on, much of this contagion got out of hand because of the old story of great populations, great movement of those peoples, and the third element, which was density. They're sorts of things that we in Australia have never really had to labour with. We've never had great numbers. I can remember when I was born, we were about 7.5, 8 million people. We're now 25. Yes, it's a lot more, but still nowhere near the numbers that you've seen around the world. 300 million in America, many millions in Europe, the same in India, 1.5 billion. Now, is it a case of just the numbers overwhelming the hospital systems and the attempts to keep people under control?
Well, of course, it started in Wuhan, which would be a very densely populated city.
Yep.
And then went from there to northern Italy, as we can see, and Milan and those places are...
And we should explain why. We should explain, it was the Chinese New Year. There are great numbers of Chinese residents who live in the heartland of Italy, in Milan and the great textile areas of Italy. And they had gone away and they basically came back and brought it with them, did they not?
Look, it did. I mean, it came from Wuhan. It took weeks, I think, for the situation to become clear. Remembering that when it did first develop, the symptoms were indistinguishable from colds and flu and sniffles.
Correct.
So it took some weeks for people to realise that this wasn't the flu or cold, but it was something really different and very contagious. Now, by that time, it had spread from Wuhan through that mechanism you talk about, I think, into northern Italy,
yep,
with people returning home or to work in Italy, and then got around. But so you had two very densely populated areas, let's say, in northern Italy and
China,
Wuhan,
yeah,
but two very different responses. When they finally figured it out and moved, they moved really fast to clobber it. They locked people down. They stopped the movement because they knew that the virus can only move with people. It doesn't move of its own accord. So it's either going to move with people and then spread in aerosol, but it can only move at the rate at which people move. The great problem, in my view, and having looked at it for the book, I think there were some unfortunate problems in Italy. I think it was at the end of the year. So Christmas was coming up and people were on the move and the cycle of the year was winding down, and this thing started to appear. But you might recall they took days and weeks to resolve to lock down in Milan. And by that stage, it had spread all through Europe and all through Italy. And then they did a very funny thing, which is to say, we're going to lock down in a few days' time. Of course, what that meant in northern Italy particularly was that people left.
Yes.
So, in advance of the deadline, which was just a purely human-made idea, the virus didn't have any clue about this deadline in 3 days, they transported the virus through the rest of Italy and out into Switzerland and neighbouring countries and so on. There was a lot of denial in the UK and Europe and in the United States, as we know. People did not want to see it for what it was, a highly infectious new virus. And by the time they worked their way through, it was too late. Now, in Australia, we had the advantage of being a long way away from the trade routes.
We didn't deny it, but we had other problems, didn't we?
We were influenced, I can tell you, the Australian government of the day at that time was influenced by the United Kingdom advisors particularly. And they said, we can't stop it. We don't want to shut the borders. We don't want to lock down. It will be like flu, and we will try to keep it out of the aged care homes, but herd immunity will take over. And you might recall there's a notorious head of the public health system in Sweden, and they went on for months about herd immunity this and herd immunity that, and that was the way in which we would deal with it. It was all completely wrong.
And the media had no idea either. They were mixed messaging throughout the entire first few months, were they not?
Well, they were. And what underpinned it was you had very strong economic interests, particularly the international travel industry and everything associated with that said, you can't possibly lock down people and stop them travelling on the international system. That's got to keep going. And they said it's either the economy or you do the public health, either or. As we can see a year later, it was never either or, it was and. People are free of the virus if they eliminate it behind strong borders, then economic activity is that much stronger and better, and the dip isn't as low. So we were going one way in Australia, thanks to over-reliance on the United Kingdom approach. And then about March the 22nd last year, after a very, very strong debate and a lot of pressure, I think the public health system in Australia, which is a tremendous asset to this country, the hundreds, thousands of people who make up that, they figured it out, the people figured it out, and they brought the pressure to bear on the premiers and the state and the territory leaders. And on the 22nd of March, they moved around the federal government and they sent the country into lockdown. And that was the single greatest thing we did. We followed what New Zealand was doing. And although there were lots of thrills and spills and deaths, terrible deaths along the way, effectively we, as a country, decided that we didn't want COVID in our lives, and that if it had to be locked down and we had to stop it getting around, we could eradicate it locally. And that's where we are. And of course, the economy is that much better. We never had the 10% contraction in GDP. We never had the very high, horrible death rates that they did in Europe. And
but
America.
we have seen, but Bill, we have seen two or three things that we never imagined we would see, and that is the federation that we imagined was all about looking after Australia. The federal government normally attends to the big issue items, and the states attend to all the little things around them. Suddenly we discovered that the Abbott government in Canberra had changed the way that the public health system was meant to be rolled out. Something that was not the case 40 years ago, but suddenly a change that Tony Abbott initiated suddenly created enormous problems.
Well, in the days of AIDS, Dr. Blewett and the government of that day and the federal parliament, and supported by the then Liberal opposition, made a big decision. They said that the public health response to HIV would be done nationally, not state by state or territory by territory, but nationally. So the federal government stepped up. There was interminable negotiation with all the state hospital systems and all the people who were in the public health system had to deal with HIV, but it was funded by the federal government, and the overall strategy was set by the federal government in collaboration and endless discussion with the state and territory governments. So we had one national response.
But
it took time. It was very good though, because it meant that we didn't have a different situation in WA to Tasmania to Melbourne and so on. And it worked pretty rapidly and effectively to do really radical, bold things. Fast forward to last year, after that system lasted until 2013.
And in 2013, Tony Abbott was in control.
Tony Abbott, when the Liberal government was elected in 2013, unlike previous Liberal governments under John Howard, unlike that,
Malcolm Fraser and others, yep.
That the public health function shouldn't sit in Canberra. They abandoned the public health structures that had lasted since the AIDS days and all went back to the states. And the responsibility was held to be at a state level. So when the big drama happened from February, March 2020, when you knocked on the public health door in Canberra, there was nobody home.
Wow.
And this, as we saw, when the states took control of policy to lock down, which was absolutely against the wishes of the federal government and their advisors, but in my view, strongly in accord with the wishes and demand of the Australian people,
yeah.
Then what did we have? We've got 9 separate governments, the 6 states, the 2 territories,
Yeah.
the government, all pursuing on the ground in the different cities slightly different and sometimes conflicting and not completely contradictory policies. You've got the federal government that gave up on quarantine and borders and said that even though it's in the Constitution is absolutely a federal responsibility, they said nothing to do with us, that's the states. And then we had the terrible fiasco of Ruby Princess, the deaths and illnesses that resulted from that, and we've seen this continuing problem in the administration of hotel quarantine and so on. But if you don't want to do it federally, you don't get what you don't pay for.
Yeah.
So Feds got out of it.
Wow.
And they got out of it, and then what came along? A tremendous upheaval, a new virus, and Australia really at federal level was caught napping. They didn't have the people, the history, the resources at federal level to respond creatively and boldly to the drama.
Well, again, listening to you describe and giving us a timeline and giving us a sense of history, it helps us to understand why things have become the way they have. If people want to know more, this is the best thing about it. Bill Bowtell, long-time strategist in health policy, has helped governments galore over the last 40 years. He's written a book, it's titled Unmasked. It's Unmasked, the Politics of Pandemics. If people want the book, Bill, how do they go about it?
They can go to Monash University Publishing. They can get it online, Amazon or booksellers. What I've tried to do is keep it short. It's not a 6-volume history. There will be a very interesting history to write about the drama of the response in Australia and around the world to COVID. I mean, the thing is by no stretch of the imagination is it over. I think we're only not even at the end of the beginning, really. We've got a lot more to go. But I've tried to synthesize really what happened in Australia, in my view, in the last year, in the hope that as we look closely and try to get our response better and come to a better understanding of what we're facing now, this might help people focus on the shortcomings we saw. Not to say the Australian response compared to almost anywhere else has been really good. It is 0-0, and we keep maintaining that. But as we see in India, 300,000-400,000 cases a day of very worrying new variants that are more infectious and more dangerous. The caseload in the world last week was almost, I think, 5 or 6 million cases a week.
If you had advice for Canberra, would you keep the international borders closed?
Yes, I would certainly say we have got to vaccinate everybody. The federal government made a very wrong series of decisions last year that ended up with us not having remotely near the supply of vaccines we could have had.
Yep.
Other countries did, but we don't have now. And now we don't even have targets by when even the most vulnerable people will be vaccinated, much less the entire Australian population. Now, it's said, yes, well, there's Pfizer and other vaccines coming and Novavax later in the year.
Yep.
But you might recall a few months ago, there were going to be 4 million done by the end of March. And we didn't even get 10% of that. So airy promises are not as important as hard and fast targets. The sooner Australians are vaccinated, the stronger we will be. And then let's see where we are. And then let's see what we can do with borders. We've got a travel bubble with New Zealand because they're the leaders in this. They've got zero. We have. So that's good. We could do it with Fiji, which is the same thing. But what happens when you open up to countries where COVID is endemic, when you've got new variants surging around the world and in our region? I mean, it's a wicked question.
It is a wicked question. But again, Bill, thank you very much for giving us the overview and the genesis of the book. It's Unmasked, the politics of pandemics. I think you told me once upon a time, it may well have been something that you learnt 40 odd years ago, you underpromise and you overdeliver.
Always a good idea in pandemics, politics, and in your personal life.
Bill Bowtell on The Informer, telling it as it is. Thank you, Bill.
Thanks, George.